The air in New York's most exclusive restaurant, Aurelia, was usually thick with the scent of money and truffle oil. But tonight it was choked with fear, because Damien Al-Jamil had arrived. He wasn't just a millionaire. He was a titan, a predator who moved through the world as if he owned it, leaving a wake of crushed competitors and broken men. Every captain of industry, every senator, every person of influence in that room either worked for him, owed him, or feared him. His power was absolute, his temper legendary. And in that gilded court of ambition, a young waitress named Clara Evans, invisible to men like him, was about to do the unthinkable. She was about to make the lion look like a fool. The whisper started at the valet stand and slithered through the restaurant like a cold draft. "He's here." It didn't need a name. There was only one he who could silence the clatter of silver on porcelain and replace the confident hum of power with the taut silence of apprehension. Damien Al-Jamil did not walk into a room. He conquered it. He was a man sculpted from harsh desert winds and hardened by the cold steel of Wall Street. Though he carried a Western name, his lineage traced back to the formidable merchant princes of the Old World, a fact he wielded with the same precision as his vast fortune. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a custom Tom Ford suit, the color of a midnight sky, and his eyes, dark and piercing, missed nothing. They were the eyes of a hawk that saw the field, the rabbit, and the rabbit's final terrified heartbeat all at once. Tonight he was dining with Senator Marcus Thorne, a man who was publicly a pillar of democracy but privately a puppet whose strings were pulled tight in Damien's fist. They were seated at table 1, the restaurant's throne, a semicircular booth of plush crimson leather that offered a panoramic view of the dining room and, more importantly, ensured everyone in the dining room had a view of them. Frank Marino, the restaurant manager, personally oversaw the service. His usual boisterous Italian charm had evaporated, replaced by a sheen of nervous sweat on his brow. The 1982 Petrus chilled to exactly 65 degrees. "Mr. Al-Jamil," Frank said, his voice a little too high. "And the beluga caviar, of course." Damien didn't even look at him. He waved a dismissive hand, his attention fixed on the senator. "The votes are secured, Marcus. Don't bore me with the details. Just ensure the Commerce Committee understands that my logistics division requires deregulation, complete deregulation." "Damien, some of the environmental reports are," the senator began, his voice weak. "Are irrelevant." Damien finished, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. The air temperature around the table seemed to drop with it. "The Earth has been here for billions of years. My port expansion project will be finished in 3. The planet will survive." He finally turned his gaze on Frank. "Is there a problem with the service tonight, Frank? You seem to be hovering." "No, sir." "Not at all, Mr. Al-Jamil. My apologies." Frank practically scurried away, his face pale. From across the room near the service station where she was polishing wine glasses, Clara Evans watched the scene unfold. She was 24, a student at the Pratt Institute, working at Aurelia 3 nights a week to pay for her art history degree and the rent on her tiny Brooklyn apartment. To Damien Al-Jamil, she was less than a ghost, a functional cog in the machine that served him. But Clara was an observer. It was the core of her nature as an artist. She didn't just see people. She saw the posture beneath the suit, the flicker of fear behind the smile, the subtle tells of a lie. She saw the way Senator Thorne's hand trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. She saw the way Frank, a man who usually commanded his restaurant with the authority of a general, seemed to shrink by 6 inches in Damien's presence. She had seen this performance before. Damien Al-Jamil was a regular, and his visits were like royal inspections. He would find a flaw, a wine served a degree too warm, a steak cooked medium instead of the medium rare he'd ordered, a perceived slight from a staff member, and he would exploit it. Not with shouting, which would be too common, but with a cold, surgical precision that left his victim utterly dismantled. He'd once had a sommelier fired on the spot for recommending a wine he deemed pedestrian. The man, a renowned expert named Charles, had simply vanished from the New York culinary scene afterward. Damien's power extended far beyond the walls of Aurelia. "Clara, table 1 needs their water refilled," whispered Maria, another waitress, her eyes wide with anxiety. "I don't want to go over there. The last time he said my perfume was an assault on his senses. I wasn't wearing any." Clara nodded, her expression calm. "I'll take it." She wasn't brave, not in the traditional sense. She was terrified of him just like everyone else, but her fear was overshadowed by a deep, simmering resentment for the kind of casual cruelty he embodied. Her world was one of passion for history and beauty, of struggling to create something meaningful. His was a world of demolition, of treating people like disposable assets. As she approached the table with a pitcher of chilled water, her movements were fluid and professional, a mask of calm she had perfected. She moved to the senator's side first, refilling his glass without a sound. Then she moved to Damien's. He was in the middle of a monologue, gesturing with a hand that wore a Patek Philippe watch worth more than her entire college tuition. Authenticity, you see, Marcus. That is the only currency with any real value. Anyone can buy a copy. Anyone can buy a business. But to possess something truly singular, something with a history that cannot be replicated, that is true power. He paused, taking a sip of the Petrus. He didn't acknowledge Clara's presence as she refilled his glass, but his eyes flickered towards her for a fraction of a second. It was a look of utter indifference, the kind one gives to a piece of furniture. As she turned to leave, his voice, sharp as broken glass, cut through the air. "Waitress!" Clara stopped her back to him. Her heart began to pound, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She turned slowly. "Sir!" His eyes roamed over her, not with interest, but with critical assessment, as if looking for a flaw in a product. "Your name?" "Clara, sir." "Clara," he repeated, letting the name hang in the air, as if tasting it for imperfections. "Your posture is adequate. You move quietly. This is good. It shows you understand your function." It wasn't a compliment. It was a classification. She was a tool performing its function correctly. Clara simply nodded, her jaw tight. "Thank you, sir." "Do not thank me," he said, his voice turning cold. "Thank your manager for training you properly. Competence is expected, not praised. You may go." Clara walked away, her hands trembling slightly. She could feel every eye in the restaurant on her, a mixture of pity and relief that it wasn't them. She returned to her station, her face a neutral mask, but inside a storm was gathering. She had seen true masterpieces in museums, paintings filled with the soul and struggle of the artist. She had studied the lives of men and women who created legacies of beauty and thought. And then there was Damien Al-Jamil, a man who spoke of authenticity, but was, to her discerning eye, the most hollow man she had ever seen. He collected things, but he understood nothing. And it was that hollowness, that fraudulent claim to a world he only owned, but could never truly appreciate, that would soon become his undoing. An hour later, The main courses had been served and cleared. The atmosphere at table 1 had shifted. The business talk was over, and Damien had moved on to his favorite topic himself and the magnificent tapestry of his acquisitions. He was holding court, his voice now imbued with a performative passion designed to awe the senator and anyone else within earshot. The subject was his latest prize, a painting he was in the final stages of acquiring through a private auction. It was The Last Voyage of the Albatross, a long-lost masterpiece by the 19th century maritime painter Julian Croft. The art world was buzzing about its resurfacing after nearly a century in a sealed Swiss vault. Croft was a master of light, but not in the way of Turner. Damien pontificated, swirling a post-dinner brandy in a large snifter. Turner's light was divine chaotic. Croft's, his was a light of grim reality. It was the cold, unforgiving light of the North Atlantic, the kind that reflects off icebergs just before they tear a hole in a ship's hull. Senator Thorne nodded along his expression, one of rapt attention, though it was clear he knew nothing about art. Incredible Damien. Truly. The Albatross is his magnum opus. Damien continued, his voice resonating with an owner's pride. It depicts the final moments of the eponymous ship caught in a tempest. But the genius is in the detail. Everyone focuses on the storm, the waves like jagged mountains. But they miss the key. In the lower left corner, almost hidden in the sea foam, Croft painted a small, discarded doll floating in the water. It's a symbol of the innocence lost to the merciless ambition of the sea. It is that single, heart-breaking detail that elevates it from a mere painting to a profound statement on man's futility. He leaned back, a smug smile playing on his lips. The so-called experts at Sotheby's and Christie's, they all missed it in their initial analyses. I was the one who spotted it from the digital prospectus. It's what convinced me I had to have it. An eye for detail. Marcus is everything. At her station, Clara froze. Every muscle in her body went rigid. The glass she was polishing stopped midway through its rotation. A doll in the lower left corner. Her mind raced. She had just written a 15-page paper on Julian Croft for her Masters of 19th Century Realism seminar. Croft was her obsession. She knew his catalogue raisonné by heart. She had spent weeks analysing his brushwork, his thematic obsessions, his subtle signatures. The Last Voyage of the Albatross was famous precisely because its history was so mysterious, but its composition was known through preliminary sketches and a single grainy photograph from a 1928 exhibition catalogue. And Clara knew, with the kind of unshakable certainty that comes from hundreds of hours of dedicated study, that there was no doll. Croft's symbolism was never so literal, so much sentimental. His work was about the brutal, unsentimental power of nature. He painted ropes, broken masts, and the cold, indifferent sea. The heartbreaking detail in The Last Voyage, according to the leading Croft scholar, Professor Alistair Finch, was far more subtle. It was a single seabird, an albatross flying away from the sinking ship, not towards it, symbolizing nature, abandoning man to his fate. The bird was in the upper right corner, often mistaken for a simple brushstroke against the dark clouds. Damien al-Jamil was wrong. And not just wrong, but confidently, arrogantly wrong. He hadn't discovered a hidden detail. He had invented one. He had concocted a story to make himself sound more perceptive, more brilliant than the experts, to bolster his narrative of being the man who sees what others miss. Clara's blood ran cold, then hot. It was one thing for him to be cruel to the staff. It was another for him to desecrate the work of an artist she revered, to twist its meaning to serve his own bloated ego. It was a lie wrapped in a veneer of culture, a forgery of intellectualism. She looked over at table 1. Damien was laughing now, accepting the senator's fawning praise. He looked invincible, a king on his throne, dispensing what he believed to be wisdom. To challenge him would be professional suicide. Frank would fire her on the spot, and Damien would likely ensure she never worked in a service job in New York again. It could even affect her standing at Pratt if he decided to extend his influence there. A man like him surely had a name on a building or two. Her mind was a battlefield. One voice, the voice of survival, screamed at her to stay quiet, to let it go. It wasn't her business. She was just a waitress. Her opinion was worthless here. But another voice, the voice of the art historian, the voice that believed in truth and beauty and the integrity of an artist's vision, whispered back. He is lying. He is defiling Croft's legacy for his own vanity. And no one in this room has the knowledge or the courage to stop him. She thought of Julian Croft, a man who died penniless and obscure, who poured his entire soul onto his canvases, seeking only to capture a harsh and beautiful truth. And now, over a century later, this barbarian was using his masterpiece as a prop in his personal theater of power. Maria bumped her shoulder gently. "You okay, Clara?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." Clara looked from Maria's worried face to Damien's triumphant one. In that moment, a quiet, steely resolve settled in her chest. It wasn't about being brave. It was about respect. Respect for her studies, for her passion for the dead artist who couldn't defend himself. She placed the wine glass down on the polished counter with a soft, definitive click. She straightened her apron, took a deep breath, and began to walk towards table 1. She had no plan, no grand strategy. She only had the truth, and she was about to find out if that was enough. As Clara approached the table, the world seemed to slow down. The ambient chatter of the restaurant faded into a dull roar, and the light seemed to converge on the crimson booth where the lion held court. Frank caught her eye from across the room, his expression a frantic mask of horror and confusion, silently pleading with her to turn back. But Clara's gaze was fixed on Damien Al-Jamil. She stopped, not beside him, but a respectful few feet from the edge of the table, ensuring she wasn't looming. She waited for a pause in the conversation, a small pocket of silence she could step into without being overtly disruptive. The moment came when Damien took another sip of his brandy. "Excuse me, Mr. Al-Jamil," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was clear and steady, cutting through the air with surprising authority. Damien lowered his glass, his eyebrows knitting together in annoyance. He didn't look at her, but at Senator Thorne, as if to say, "Can you believe the audacity? I did not summon you," he said, his voice flat and cold. "I know, sir. I apologize for the interruption." Clara said, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it, the point of no return. "I couldn't help but overhear your commentary on Julian Croft's The Last Voyage of the Albatross. I am a great admirer of his work." A flicker of surprise registered on Damien's face. He seemed momentarily intrigued by the novelty of it, like a king finding a talking mouse. "Is that so?" he said, a condescending smirk touching his lips. "And what does a waitress know of Julian Croft? I'm studying his work at the Pratt Institute," Clara stated, simply refusing to be baited. "My thesis is on the symbolic use of fauna in his later period." The senator shifted uncomfortably. This was not part of the script. How fascinating, Damien said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Do you have a point, or are you just seeking a commendation on your extracurricular activities? I have a point, sir, Clara said, meeting his gaze directly now. The full force of his intimidating presence washed over her, but she held her ground. You mentioned a detail in the painting, a doll in the lower left corner symbolizing lost innocence. I did, Damien said, his eyes narrowing. A detail that escaped the so-called experts, a testament to a keen eye. He was daring her, practically begging her to contradict him so he could crush her. I'm afraid there might be some mistake, sir, Clara said, her voice remaining perfectly level and respectful. All existing scholarship, including Croft's own preliminary sketches held at the National Maritime Museum, indicates that the key symbolic detail in that painting is not a doll. The silence at the table was now absolute. Even the clatter from the kitchen seemed to have ceased. Senator Thorne looked as if he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Damien placed his brandy snifter down on the table with a loud, deliberate thud. The smile was gone, replaced by a mask of cold fury. A mistake, he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. Are you a part-time waitress, standing here and telling me that I am mistaken? I am saying that the historical record and the artist's known thematic tendencies do not support the presence of a doll, Clara clarified, choosing her words with surgical precision. The detail scholars have long identified as Croft's statement on futility, as you so eloquently put it, is the lone albatross in the upper right corner flying away from the wreck. It signifies nature's indifference, a theme consistent throughout his oeuvre. A doll would be uncharacteristically sentimental for Croft. Every word was a hammer blow to Damien's carefully constructed facade. She wasn't just saying he was wrong. She was explaining why he was wrong, using the language of art history, a language he had only pretended to speak. She was exposing him as a fraud in the very arena he had chosen for his display of superiority. For a moment, Damien Al-Jamil looked utterly stunned. His air of invincibility evaporated, replaced by the raw, naked shock of a man who had never been challenged, let alone corrected, especially not by someone he considered less than human. Then the shock curdled into rage, a deep, venomous rage that made his face pale and his knuckles white as he gripped the table. "You are insolent!" He hissed the words, tight and controlled, yet more menacing than any shout. "You think your little night school class gives you the right to question me?" "It's not about my rights," Clara replied, her own fear now replaced by a strange sense of calm. She had spoken the truth, and the consequences no longer mattered as much as that fact. "It's about the artist's work, the truth of the painting." "The truth?" Damien laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Let me teach you a lesson about the truth, little girl. The truth is what I say it is. The truth is that I am in the process of paying $30 million for that canvas. When it is in my possession, if I say it has a dancing monkey in the corner, then it will have a dancing monkey. Its story will be the one I choose to tell." He stood up, his tall frame looming over her. "And you have just told your last story in this establishment. You're fired." He turned his venomous gaze on Frank, who was now rushing towards the table, his face ashen. "Frank, get this thing out of my sight, and have her final paycheck delivered to my office. I will personally deduct the cost of my ruined evening from it." Frank grabbed Clara's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Miss Evans, come with me. Now." He was pulling her away, trying to de-escalate to save his restaurant. But Clara had one last shot to fire. She looked past Frank directly at Damien Al-Jamil. "You can buy the canvas, sir," she said, her voice ringing out in the silent restaurant. "But you can't buy the truth of what it is. And a lie, no matter how much you pay for it, is always ultimately ridiculous." The word hung in the air. Ridiculous. It was the perfect word. It didn't just label him a liar. It labeled him a fool, a rich, powerful, but ultimately ridiculous man, playing dress-up as a connoisseur. The blood drained from Damien's face, then returned in a furious, mottled flush. He looked for the first time not like a lion, but like a bully on a playground who had just been publicly shamed. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He had been so thoroughly dismantled, his intellectual authority so completely undermined, that his usual weapons of wealth and intimidation were useless. Senator Thorne stared down at his plate, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on the porcelain. Everyone in the restaurant was frozen, watching the unbelievable spectacle. As Frank finally managed to hustle Clara towards the kitchen doors, a new sound entered the room. It was a soft chuckle. A low, appreciative laugh came from a corner table where a quiet, elderly gentleman named Mr. Arthur Peterson had been dining alone, watching the entire exchange with keen, intelligent eyes. The laugh, though quiet, was a spark in the powder keg of Damien Al-Jamil's humiliation. It was the sound of his authority not just being challenged, but being mocked. And in that moment, the feared Damien Al-Jamil looked utterly, completely, and undeniably ridiculous. The kitchen doors swung shut behind them, and the hushed drama of the dining room was replaced by the chaotic symphony of a busy restaurant kitchen. The clatter of pans, the hiss of the grill, and the shouts of chefs seemed a world away from the icy confrontation that had just occurred. Frank let go of Clara's arm, his face a jumble of fury, fear, and a sliver of disbelief. "What in God's name were you thinking, Clara?" he hissed, his voice trembling. "Do you have any idea who that is? That's not just a rich customer. That's Damien Al-Jamil. He could buy this building and have it torn down for a parking lot by tomorrow morning if he felt like it." "He was lying, Frank," Clara said, her own adrenaline starting to recede, leaving a shaky emptiness in its wake. "I don't care if he said the sky was green with purple polka dots," Frank exclaimed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "You work here. Your job is to pour water, take orders, and smile. Your job is not to give art history lectures to men who could end your career with a single phone call. You're fired. I have no choice. You have to go. Now." Clara nodded slowly. She had known this was the inevitable outcome. "I understand." She turned and walked to the staff locker room, her legs feeling like lead. The other waitstaff averted their eyes, whispering amongst themselves. She was no longer one of them. She was a cautionary tale. She quickly changed out of her uniform and into her street clothes, jeans, and a simple sweater. As she gathered her belongings, the weight of her actions finally crashed down on her. She hadn't just lost a job. She had provoked a monster. Frank's words echoed in her mind. What if Damien didn't stop at just getting her fired? She walked out the back alley entrance, the cold night air a shock to her system. The city lights of New York seemed to mock her, a glittering paradise she had just been exiled from. She had stood up for her principles, but what good were principles if she couldn't pay her rent or afford her tuition? Doubt began to creep in, cold and sharp. "Miss Evans." The voice was calm and cultured, and it came from the shadows of the alley. Clara jumped, spinning around to see the elderly gentleman from the corner table. It was Mr. Peterson, the man who had laughed. He was impeccably dressed in an old but well-maintained tweed jacket and held a classic wooden cane, though he didn't seem to need it for support. His eyes behind thick-lensed glasses were bright, with an intelligence that reminded her of one of her favorite professors. "Mr. Peterson," she said, surprised. He was a quiet regular, always reading a book, always polite. He seemed so out of place in this grimy alley. "Arthur, please," he said with a small, wry smile. "I wanted to offer you my compliments. What you did there. I haven't seen anything that brave in a very, very long time." "Brave or stupid," Clara muttered, pulling her coat tighter around herself. "I just lost my job." "You did more than that," Arthur Peterson said, his smile fading into a more serious expression. "You exposed Damien Al-Jamil for what he is, a hollow man, a fraud, and you did it publicly. He will never forgive you for that." This wasn't comforting. "Thank you for the vote of confidence," she said wryly. "It wasn't meant to be," he replied. "It was a warning. I know him, you see. Better than most. I know what he is capable of." Clara looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time. There was a deep-seated weariness in his face, a history of pain behind the sharp eyes. "How do you know him?" Arthur Peterson sighed, tapping his cane softly on the broken pavement. "My family used to own a publishing house, Peterson & Sons. We specialized in academic texts, art history books, poetry. It was my grandfather's legacy. We weren't a massive conglomerate, but we were respected. We published the first definitive guide to Julian Croft's work, in fact, Alistair Finch's seminal text." Clara's eyes widened. "I've read it. It's the Bible for Croft scholars." "It was," Arthur said with a sad smile. 5 years ago, Al-Jamil decided he wanted to enter the media world. He staged a hostile takeover of Peterson & Sons. He didn't want our legacy or our authors. He wanted our real estate in Midtown and our distribution network. He bought the company, gutted it, sold off the assets, and fired everyone. My family's work of 3 generations erased in less than 6 months. He called it streamlining for the new media landscape. I called it vandalism. The pieces clicked into place for Clara. Mr. Peterson wasn't just a spectator, he was a casualty. His quiet dinners at Aurelia, a restaurant frequented by his destroyer, suddenly seemed less like a coincidence and more like a vigil. "I'm so sorry," she said the words, feeling inadequate. "Don't be," he said, his gaze hardening. "Be prepared. He won't be content with you losing your job. The humiliation you dealt him tonight was profound. He will see it as a debt, and his debts are always paid with interest. He will try to ruin you, Miss Evans. He'll look into your school, your finances, your family. He will find a pressure point and squeeze until you break." A wave of real fear, colder and deeper than any she had felt before, washed over Clara. This was no longer about a lost job. This was about her entire life. "What can I do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Arthur Peterson looked up and down the dark alley, then back at her. A new light had entered his eyes, not just intelligence, but the glint of a long-dormant fighting spirit. "For 5 years I have watched that man operate with impunity," he said, his voice low and intense. "I have been a ghost, a relic of a company he devoured. But tonight you reminded me that even the most formidable predator can be made to look foolish. You found a chink in his armor. Not his finances, not his political connections, but his ego, his fraudulent intellectualism." He stepped closer, his expression resolute. "You cannot fight him on his terms. You don't have the money or the power. But you have something he doesn't: authenticity. The very thing he pretends to value. You have the truth. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a simple business card. It was old and elegant, with embossed lettering: Arthur Peterson, Peterson & Sons Publishing. The name was definitely uncrossed out. "He thinks this is over," Arthur said. "He thinks you are a fly he has swatted. He will move to acquire his painting, to erase tonight's embarrassment with the sheer force of his wealth. But we are not going to let him. You and I, Miss Evans, are going to give Mr. Al-Jamil a proper lesson in art history. We are going to take your truth and turn it into a weapon he never sees coming." Clara looked down at the card in her hand, then backed up at the determined old man. An hour ago she was a waitress. Now she was unemployed, a target, and an ally. She was terrified, but for the first time since she had walked away from that table, she wasn't alone. "Okay, Arthur," she said, her voice finding its strength again. "What do we do first?" Damien. Al-Jamil was not a man who tolerated humiliation. He processed it, converted it into a cold, hard fuel for revenge, and then executed that revenge with the methodical brutality of a state-sponsored demolition. The laughter of Arthur Peterson had been the spark, but Clara's final word, ridiculous, was the inferno that now burned within him. The morning after the incident at Aurelia, the siege began. It was not a physical siege with battering rams, but a modern corporate one, far more insidious and devastating. The first salvo was aimed at the restaurant itself. By 9:00 a.m., Frank Marino received a call from the holding company that owned the building on Park Avenue. Their largest shareholder, a previously anonymous offshore entity, had been bought out overnight. The new majority owner was a company named Jamil Global Holdings. An emergency board meeting was called. The agenda a review of the lease agreement with a tenant named Aurelia, which was reportedly suffering from a decline in service standards. Frank felt a cold dread creep up his spine. Damien wasn't just tearing down the parking lot. He was buying the whole street to do it. The second salvo was a targeted media strike. By lunchtime, a notorious gossip columnist for the New York Post, a man well known for being on Damien's payroll, published a blind item: which high-end eatery is letting its unhinged staff accost and insult its most valued patrons. Seems one waitress with delusions of grandeur decided to trade her tip tray for a soapbox, leading to a shocking display that has the city's elite thinking twice about their reservations. It was vague, but for those in the know, the message was clear. Aurelia was toxic. Bookings for the following weeks began to be cancelled in droves, but the most personal and terrifying assault was reserved for Clara. When she met Arthur at a small, anonymous coffee shop in the village that afternoon, her face was pale and her hands trembled as she held her phone. "He found me," she whispered, her voice strained. "I got an email this morning from the Dean of Students at Pratt. It was very formal. It said an anonymous complaint had been lodged against me regarding a potential violation of the Student Code of Conduct outside of university grounds. It says there's going to be an inquiry into whether my public behavior has brought the institution into disrepute." Arthur's face grew grim. An anonymous complaint from a man who is likely one of their most generous benefactors. The Al-Jamil wing of the architecture school, perhaps. Clara nodded numbly. It was dedicated 2 years ago. I didn't make the connection. They're putting my scholarship under review pending the outcome of the inquiry. My scholarship, Arthur. Without it, I can't. She trailed off, the implication hanging heavy in the air. "He's cutting you off at the knees," Arthur said, his voice tight with anger. He's not just taking your job, he's taking your future. This is his way. He isolates his targets, severs their lifelines, and watches them wither. Clara felt a rising tide of panic. This was happening too fast. His power was immense, his reach seemingly infinite. He was a leviathan, and she was in a rowboat, frantically paddling against the tide he created. What do we do? How can we fight this? He owns everything. Not everything, Arthur said, his calm a stark contrast to her panic. He took a sip of his tea, his eyes thoughtful. He doesn't own the past. He doesn't own the truth. Right now, he is reacting with pure wounded pride. He's using a sledgehammer to kill a fly. But his focus is still on the prize that caused all this trouble, the painting. He slid a copy of an Art World journal across the table. The headline read, "Al-Jamil nears acquisition of lost Croft masterpiece." The private auction, hosted by a boutique firm named Elysian Heritage Auctions, was set for the end of the week. "This is his next move," Arthur explained. "He will publicly purchase the last voyage of the Albatross for a record-breaking sum. He will then magnanimously loan it to a museum, perhaps the Met. And when the museum displays it, the plaque will read, 'On loan from the collection of Damien Al-Jamil,' and the description will of course mention the profound, previously undiscovered detail of the floating doll. He will literally rewrite art history to erase his humiliation. He will make his lie the official truth, and your correction will be forgotten, dismissed as the ramblings of a disgruntled waitress." Clara stared at the magazine, at the smirking photo of Damien Al-Jamil beside the article. He was creating his own reality, and he had the money to force everyone else to live in it. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. "So we can't let him get the painting," Clara said, a new resolve hardening her voice. "Bidding against him is impossible," Arthur countered. "He'd pay $1 billion for it, just to prove a point. No, we cannot stop the sale. But we can change the story." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You said yourself, a doll is uncharacteristically sentimental for Croft. It's a clumsy, obvious piece of symbolism. Why did Al-Jamil invent that specific lie? Why not something more plausible, a hidden signature, a face in the clouds? Why a doll?" Clara frowned, considering it for the first time. "I don't know, it's amateurish. It's the kind of detail someone with no real understanding of art would think is profound." "Exactly," Arthur said, his eyes gleaming. "It's a mistake, an unforced error, and in my experience men like Damien Al-Jamil don't make mistakes without a reason. Their ego is usually too polished. This lie feels personal. It came from somewhere deep inside him. It wasn't just a random boast. It was a story he needed to tell." A new path forward began to illuminate in Clara's mind, pushing back the shadows of fear. They couldn't fight his money or his influence. The siege was unwinnable on his terms. But they could become detectives. They could investigate the lie itself. "So we don't focus on Damien," Clara said, thinking aloud. "We focus on the painting, and we focus on the doll. We need to find out everything we can about the last voyage, its history, its ownership, its journey through the last century." "Precisely," Arthur affirmed. "His power is in the present. He controls the media, the markets, the politicians. But the past is a foreign country, and its borders are not so easily controlled. We need to find something in the painting's history that contradicts his narrative in a way he cannot bury." The siege was on. Damien was bombarding them with all the power of his modern empire. But Clara and Arthur were preparing a counterattack, not with weapons of wealth, but with dusty books, forgotten archives, and the unshakable conviction that somewhere hidden in the long and silent history of a single painting lay a truth that could bring a giant to his knees. Their investigation had begun. The next few days were a blur of frantic clandestine research. While Damien's lawyers were tightening the screws on Pratt and finalizing the paperwork to evict Aurelia Clara, and Arthur established a makeshift headquarters in the back room of Arthur's dusty, book-filled apartment on the Upper West Side. It was a war room papered not with battle plans, but with photocopied auction records, museum catalogues, and timelines scribbled on a large whiteboard. They operated on the assumption that Damien's lie about the doll was not random. It was a psychological fingerprint left at the scene of the crime. Their mission was to uncover the origin of that fingerprint. Their first breakthrough came from the archives of Peterson & Sons Publishing. Arthur still had copies of nearly every book his family had ever printed. In a long-forgotten crate, they found the original research files for Professor Finch's book on Julian Croft, including correspondence from the 1970s. "Listen to this," Arthur said, reading from a fragile typewritten letter. It was from a retired art restorer in Liverpool who had claimed his grandfather worked as a dockhand for the shipping company that first owned the painting in the 1890s. He writes, "My grandfather always told a story about the big Croft painting. Said the shipping magnate who commissioned it, a Mr. Blackwood, hated the final piece. I called it morbid, but Blackwood's young daughter Elara adored it. She would sit in front of it for hours. Grandad said she even gave the ship a little toy to keep it company on its sad voyage." Clara looked up from her laptop, her eyes wide. "A toy?" "He doesn't say what kind of toy." "No, just a little toy," Arthur said, his excitement palpable. "But the name, Elara, it's an old name. Almost like Clara." He gave her a meaningful look. The connection was tenuous, a ghost of a whisper across a century. But it was the first time anything resembling a child's plaything had been associated with the painting. Still, it wasn't a doll painted onto the canvas. It was something external, a child's game. Their next step was tracing the painting's provenance, its chain of ownership. After the Blackwood family's shipping empire went bankrupt in the early 20th century, their assets were liquidated. The last voyage of the Albatross was sold in a chaotic estate auction in 1928. This was where the official record, the one Damien and the auction house relied on, got murky. The painting was listed as sold to a private European collector and then vanished into a Swiss vault only to reappear now. "The auction records from that time are a mess," Clara said, scrolling through digitized pages of a yellowed 1928 ledger. "Most sales are just listed with a surname, Smith Dubois Cohen. It could be anyone. Damien's people will have done their due diligence, but only as far as they needed to establish a clear title for the sale," Arthur reasoned. "They wouldn't dig for stories. They'd only dig for legal ownership. We need to dig for the human element." For 2 days, they cross-referenced the surnames from the auction ledger with immigration records, ship passenger lists, and census data from the period. It was a painstaking needle-in-a-haystack search. Clara's art history training had made her a meticulous researcher, able to spend hours sifting through dry data for a single, shining detail. Late on the third night, fueled by stale coffee and sheer determination, she found it. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice hoarse with fatigue and excitement. "Come look at this." On the screen was a passenger manifest for the SS Majestic, which sailed from Southampton to New York in April 1929. One name on the third-class passenger list stood out: Jamil Elias. Under occupation, it listed carpenter. He was traveling with his wife and their young son. Jamil, Arthur breathed, leaning closer. It could be a coincidence. Maybe, Clara said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. But the ledger from the Blackwood auction, there's a sale entry for a large unnamed maritime painting to a buyer listed only as Jamil. The price was £50, a huge sum for a carpenter, but not an impossible one if it was his life savings. A carpenter from Lebanon buying a massive oil painting of a sinking British ship, Arthur mused. It makes no sense as an art investment. It must have been for personal reasons. Clara's mind was racing, connecting the dots. What if Elias Jamil was one of the thousands of migrant workers who passed through Liverpool's docks? What if he worked there just like the art restorer's grandfather? What if he saw the painting, heard the stories about the little girl, Elara, who loved it? They kept digging now with a name and a new direction. They scoured New York City archives. They found Elias Jamil in the 1930 census, living in a crowded tenement on the Lower East Side. He worked as a cabinet maker, a skilled tradesman. But then tragedy. His wife died in 1932. Elias struggled as a single father during the Great Depression. The records showed he sold off possessions to make ends meet. In 1934, there was a pawn shop record for the sale of one large painting in ornate frame for the pitiful sum of $20. The buyer was a minor art dealer who a few years later sold his entire collection to a Swiss financier. That was how it ended up in the vault. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that made Clara's blood run cold, came from a small digitized newspaper clipping from a local community paper in 1934. It was a brief human interest story about the struggles of immigrants during the Depression. It featured a short interview with Elias Jamil. Clara read the key passage aloud, her voice trembling. "It is hard," the carpenter Mr. Jamil said through a translator. "I must sell everything, even the picture. My son, he cries. He loves the picture of the big ship. When he was a baby, his mother made him a small rag doll. He would hold the doll up to the glass and say, 'Don't be scared. She will ride the waves with you.'" The article ended there. Silence descended on the small room, thick and heavy with the weight of history. There it was, the Achilles heel, the origin of the lie. The doll wasn't in the painting. The doll was in the story, a family story, a story of poverty loss and a father's love. Damien al-Jamil hadn't invented the detail out of thin air. He had dredged it up from a memory he had likely suppressed for his entire life. He wasn't the descendant of Arab merchant princes. He was the grandson of Elias Jamil, a poor carpenter from the Lower East Side. The painting wasn't just a status symbol. It was the last remnant of a past he had spent his entire fortune trying to erase. His desperate attempt to reclaim it wasn't about art. It was about his own history. But in his arrogance, he had conflated a treasured family memory with the physical reality of the canvas. He had projected his own childhood onto the painting and in his hubris declared his personal story to be a universal hidden truth of the artwork. "My God," Arthur whispered, sinking into a chair. "He's not just a liar. He's a man at war with himself. He despises his own humble origins so much that he's created this entire fantasy of being old money, of being a connoisseur by birthright. Buying this painting is his way of finally conquering his own past, of owning the story, instead of being owned by it." Clara looked at the whiteboard at the timeline of a family's struggle. The siege suddenly felt different. They weren't just fighting a corporate titan. They were fighting a man's deepest, most painful secret. "The auction is tomorrow," Clara said. "He's going to buy it, and he's going to cement his lie into history." "Perhaps," Arthur said, a slow, strategic smile spreading across his face. "But a story can be a powerful weapon, and we now have the true one. He wants to be the one who tells the painting's story fine. Let's give him the stage, and then let's give him the ending he never saw coming." The Elysian Heritage Auction was meant to be Damian Al-Jamil's coronation. Held in a private salon at the Pierre Hotel, the room was a fortress of quiet money. At the front, the last voyage of the Albatross rested under a perfect spotlight, its dark, churning waves waiting for their new owner. Damien sat in the front row, holding paddle number 1. His victory was a foregone conclusion. The bidding was a brief formality. As the price climbed past 20 million other collectors, demurred, unwilling to challenge a man, bidding with the full force of his ego. 30 million. Damien stated his voice calm and clear, not even bothering to wait for the auctioneer. It was a declaration, not a bid. Silence. "Sold," the auctioneer announced to Mr. Damian Al-Jamil. Polite applause followed. Damien gave a regal nod as reporters invited by his own team swarmed him. This was the moment. He'd engineered the moment to cement his lie into history. "Mr. Al-Jamil, what does this masterpiece mean to you?" a reporter from the Wall Street Journal asked. "It represents the triumph of a discerning eye." Damien began, his voice smooth as silk. "For decades, its deepest secret went unnoticed. Experts saw only a storm. But I saw its heart, a small detail of a child's doll lost in the waves, a profound symbol of—" "Excuse me." The voice, clear and steady, cut through the salon. The crowd turned. Standing at the back of the room were Clara Evans and Arthur Peterson. They hadn't been invited, but they were here. Damien's face froze, his triumph instantly souring into cold fury. "Security," he snapped. "Remove them." "We just came to congratulate you, Damien," Arthur called out, his voice surprisingly strong. "And to thank you. Your interest in the painting inspired us to uncover its true story. It's a wonderful American immigrant story." The reporters, sensing a far better headline, pivoted their cameras and microphones, swinging toward Clara and Arthur. The security guards paused, caught in the middle. Clara stepped forward, her eyes locked on Damien. "The painting wasn't brought to this country by a wealthy collector," she said, her voice ringing with the authority of fact. "It was brought here in 1929 by a carpenter from Lebanon named Elias Jamil." A gasp went through the room. Damien's face went white. "He was your grandfather," Clara continued, pressing the truth into the silence. "He bought it with his life savings because his young son, your father, loved the painting. That little boy had a rag doll his mother made him, and he would hold it up to the glass. There is no doll in the painting, Mr. Al-Jamil. The doll was in your father's hand. It was a beautiful family memory that you twisted into a lie to build a false identity for yourself." She held up a folder. "We have it all. The ship's manifest with your grandfather's name. The pawn shop receipt from 1934, when he sold it for $20. The local newspaper article where he spoke of his son's love for the painting." She didn't yell. She simply presented the truth. In an instant, Damien's grand narrative shattered. The descendant of merchant princes was revealed to be the grandson of a poor carpenter. His $30 million purchase was no longer a trophy. It was a monument to his own shame. The titan of industry looked small, a man terrified of his own humble past. He didn't rage. He didn't speak. all the fight drained out of him. He stared at the painting of the storm-tossed ship, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the room, past the flashing cameras and shocked faces, a hollowed-out man finally conquered by the one thing he could never buy: the truth. The story of Damian al-Jamil's public unraveling became a legend in New York's elite circles. The lie was more damaging than any financial scandal could ever be. His carefully crafted aura of infallibility was gone, replaced by the pitying whispers about the man who was ashamed of his own grandfather. His empire didn't crumble overnight, but its foundation was cracked. Deals became harder, rivals grew bolder, and the fear he once commanded was replaced with a quiet, knowing contempt. Clara Evans, with Arthur Peterson's help, not only had her scholarship at Pratt reinstated, but was offered a full fellowship, funded by an anonymous donor, who many suspected was a rival of Damian's, delighted by his fall. Aurelia survived, with Frank Marino developing a newfound respect for his staff. The truth of the painting, the story of Elias Jamil, became its official history, a testament to an immigrant's dream. Clara showed the world that true power isn't measured in dollars or skyscrapers. It's found in the courage to speak the truth, the integrity to honor the past, and the simple fact that no lie, no matter how grand, can withstand the quiet force of one person who knows the real story. If you were moved by Clara's courage and the incredible power of the truth, please hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another tale of the underdog taking on the giants. What did you think of Damian's downfall? Let us know in the comments below. We believe in the power of stories, and with your support, we can continue to bring them to you. Thank you for watching.